One of the issues identified by the National Development Plan as a major obstacle to South Africa's future is the issue of corruption. Joining me in studio to discuss this issue today is Director of Corruption Watch, Dave Lewis. Dave, you have a background in union movements, policy making, as well more recently as the former chairperson of the Competition Tribunal. You look at this problem quite deeply. There's a lot of talk about corruption in South Africa. What is the scale of the problem, really?
It's large. I mean, it's by no means the largest in the world. We're by no means the worst country in the world. But the bad news is that we're sort of sliding down all of the international rankings. And although we are somewhere in the middle of the rankings at the moment, I suppose the worst news is that if we fall much further, you join a group of countries who are grappling with a problem that really probably can't be solved or even impacted upon to much extent. And so, I suppose, yes, we're not the worst in the world, but that's not a reason for feeling smug. It's a reason for worrying that we might get down there, and we need to do something to stop that right now.
I think one of the rankings I looked at placed us at, I think, number 77 out of 177, something like that.
Yes.
And there's obviously a lot of debate in South Africa about the perception of corruption versus the reality, and then also corruption in the public sector versus private sector. Where is the problem, and what is the nature of the problem?
Well, I don't go with this perception versus reality thing. I mean, perceptions are not made of nothing. And if this is what the public perceive the extent of corruption to be, then this is what the politicians and the law enforcement agencies and those with the power to really impact upon the problem should be, this is how they should prioritize it. The problem is wherever public resources are to be found, there's a problem. Sometimes oftentimes, I mean, particularly where procurement corruption is concerned, which is obviously where the big money in corruption is, there's a private sector element and there's a public sector element, almost by definition, involved. Sometimes there's only a public sector element involved, as when, a public servant abuses state resources or embezzles state resources in some way or another. On rare occasions, and cartels might be one such occasion, there is only a private sector element involved. I mean, I have no problem with the notion that somebody who agrees to take on as his employment a job that involves him being imbued with public power or him having access to state resources by virtue of being a public servant should actually have a special duty to treat that power with respect and to treat those resources with respect. So, yes, it's not only a public sector problem, it's also a private sector problem, but it's a problem with public resources, and whoever has access to those resources needs to treat them with the respect that looking after somebody else's resources deserves.
That obviously means that there needs to be systems, processes to ensure accountability, transparency, good governance in general. Some may argue that South Africa has some of the best governance structures and processes. We have King 3, we have regulation, the Ethics Act in Parliament, for instance. If we have all these sophisticated regulations and laws and things aiding us in this regard, why does the problem persist?
Well, we have a notorious proclivity. I think it's becoming a notorious proclivity for having great legislation but not enforcing it very effectively. And in the corruption arena, in the sort of hardcore corruption arena, which is within criminal law, the law enforcement and the prosecutorial authorities are under-resourced, they are not competent, and there is a large-scale corruption problem within those institutions as well. So that's one of the reasons why we have the problem. In procurement, which as I said earlier is obviously a particular area of problem, or a particular problem area for corruption. I think we have much too fragmented a system. In the old apartheid days, we had a single state tender board, and that may have had its own problems, and I'm not really suggesting that we need centralization of that scale. But at the moment, I mean, notoriously, and this might be urban legend, in the Eastern Cape alone, there are more than 6,000 points of procurement. of public procurement, and that's a real system fault that needs to be corrected.
Obviously, that kind of fragmentation opens it up to all kinds of opportunities for interference in that process.
It opens itself up to opportunities for sure, but it also means that every one of those points, like, we've done a lot of work on schools corruption, for example, the corruption of school resources, and the sums of money involved in each single act are not very large, although aggregated they start to look like very big numbers. But it means around every school you have a group of interests clustered who are accumulating personally on the basis of the procurement system, and so who are going to resist having that gravy train removed from them. And so that's the real problem that you get, is that once you've given people this opportunity, they are going to resist having it taken away from them.
Of course, behind every corrupt act in an institutional form, there are individuals, like you say, that are making these decisions, and that really brings it to the dimension of culture and values. Looking at South Africa, where we are in terms of our national development and a sense of national culture and the values that we should espouse to as South Africans, what is the work that needs to be done in constructing a culture that is anti-corruption?
Well, I think, we try to avoid being too preachy. I mean, I think that values and ethics have got a hell of a lot to do with things. I don't really know how to answer that question. I mean, we're doing a lot of work on behaviour change, and this is starting to become a big part of our work with the youth, so-called, who I think have a big role to play in actually influencing adults. It's not simply because they are the leaders of tomorrow, as they so often cast, but because very often they're the leaders of today, and we want to engage with them on the issue at partly at an ethical level. But sure, I mean, I think that what you need is a kind of culture of respect for public, as I say, for public resources, and for understanding that even if you're an immensely powerful elected politician, a public official, that doesn't mean that the resources that belong to the public are yours. And at a very simple level, that's the lesson that needs to get across,
I think, as you say, at the heart of that is the issue of respect for one another, respect for the belongings of others and of the public good. And with that, there obviously is a lot of work to be done in South Africa in this regard as we look over the next few years, both in the public sector, private sector, and then, of course, through civil society by the likes of yourselves. Dave Lewis, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Marius.